interviewing like a bunch of different people about alternative, non-toxic ways to be masculine.
I grew up seeing people say, this is for this gender, this is for just this gender across cultures. And I think mostly it just made me a little bit of a contrarian with gender. I was like, no, like, but here this happens here, this happens here. So somebody's got to be wrong, and maybe none of this is for gender. And we've all created these boxes.
I was, bullied. I was made fun of because I was always last, or I was the sissy or the girl. But when it came time to, playing with dolls or making clothes for them or planting flowers in gardens, I was really good at that. And it just has evolved to where I am today.
You've been told your entire life that there's only one way to be. And that's not what you are. Then that means that you're nothing. And for me, thanks to my eternal optimism, I knew that I wasn't nothing. So it shifted the way that I saw everything.
And specifically that men are the perpetrators, it's really sad to me, and it's disappointing because I'm part of the male gender, I guess, but I try to be a different example and try to say, look, there are people out here that are doing things differently that you can trust and that aren't going to do horrible things.
Making this documentary, when I'm talking to them about their sexuality or like masculinity growing up, I was just like, I realized like a lot of the stuff wasn't kind of resolved.
Like for you?
For me.
With, was it Wild at Heart and everything, being taught about masculinity was a huge part of our upbringing.
You were the pastor's son, and so everyone knew you, but in a way, that probably made you feel invisible.
Yeah.
Because they saw you one way, and you couldn't fulfill that.
like who decided what is and what isn't masculine?
It's interesting to hear that you originally intended this to be a short film feature, because one of the questions I had was, when you were putting this together, oftentimes you hear about the making of documentaries. They can be sort of painstaking because you're collecting interview footage or whatever kind of primary footage you're using, and then you sort of find the spine of the narrative in what could be hours and hours and hours of footage. When it was all said and done, since you're down to the editing process and you feel like you have a cut that's somewhat locked, how much did you film versus how much you're using?
Oh my goodness. I mean, it's hard to think. I mean, we just have hours and hours and hours, and it's going to be like an 80-minute, thing. Like each interview that I did, I interviewed 7 people, and each interview runs like 2 hours at least. And then that's not even counting all the other footage that I had shot after the interviews. And it really is, it's interesting because it really is about like that. It feels like the opposite of narrative filmmaking, where it's like you have a script and then you shoot the script and you kind of just put it together in post-production. It's like you almost like shoot without a script, and then like editing is like writing the script in a lot of ways, because you're like trying to figure out like, okay, what is the structure? What do we have by looking at what you shot? Like, and even for example, like I thought I was like done shooting, and then we went to edit and we're like, oh no, we're not done shooting. We need to like go back and film hours more. So it's a unique process, and one that's kind of unique or been new to me, having done a lot of narrative work before.
Yeah. And were you familiar with most of your interview subjects? Like, did you know exactly who you were going to be talking to, or did you find them in like casting calls, or how did you come across most of your subjects?
Yeah, honestly, most of them, I would say all of them were just people I had come across in my life in various circles. So who I just like thought were really fascinating like people, and really were modeling like non-traditional kind of ways of masculinity. And so it was really I did some outreach, but a lot of it was is people that over the past 8 years of living in Los Angeles and working at a nonprofit and volunteering or doing filmmaking, kind of those worlds, just found people who were willing to go on camera and share their life stories. So
one of the things that was really interesting about your documentary and that you mentioned was that you decided to include your story in sort of after the fact, after you'd already collected or during somewhere in the process, you found out that, and I think this is so often the case, even with narrative filmmakers, even a lot of times with filmmakers who are working from other people's screenplays, is that they find out that their first few films are movies about themselves in some form or another. And was that a sort of discombobulating experience, being able to, you know, collect this footage from your life and then figure out what is your story in this? Did it feel sort of journalistic or yeah, kind of walk us through that experience.
Yeah, it's sorry, I just laugh because it's been very terrifying, but very healing at the same time. But yeah, I think it wasn't even for a long time. I was like, I'm not going to be in it, and then it was multiple people kept saying, I think you should be in it. I think your experiences might be what holds it together. And I kept saying, no, 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 I'm not going to do that. And then after numerous people said that's what I should do, and I was trying to edit it together and it wasn't working, I was like, maybe I should actually do this. And I went through kind of really trying to figure out, looking at documentarians' various works, different ways of telling their stories, right? And trying to kind of figure out what my approach would be to telling my story. But it was really challenging. I don't know, going back into looking at home videos can be this mixture of sadness mixed with humor a lot of the times, and that can be its own experience. And I decided to how I decided to ultimately do it was talk to childhood friends and have conversations with them about our upbringing, collective upbringing, and through that tell my narrative. And so instead of doing voiceover, or instead of even me talking directly to the camera, it's me kind of having these various conversations with people and family members and that kind of stuff, while also including home videos.
Yeah, and I think it's a really smart way to go about it. I think a lot of the times, for me personally, when I watch documentaries and the director has to break the fourth wall and stare directly into camera and start telling you, the audience, what the movie is, it can sort of take me out a little bit, or they don't have enough faith in the material to tell itself. Whereas with you, you're literally turning yourself into one of many different subjects.
Yeah.
And it still allows that sort of degree of separation where now it becomes more autobiographical.
Yeah. And I think, and I think there's something, hopefully it has that. I'm really kind of going for pre-chorus approach, and for stories that contradict, and the film really tries to highlight contradictions and or similarities, and does that so everything is in conversation with each other. And I think by having it, instead of, because for a while I was going to do voiceover, where it was going to be voiceover over images and me telling what I thought my story was, but this way is much more vulnerable because I'm in front of the camera and I'm having conversations that I don't know where they're going to go, with people from my past who I'm not really sure. Everyone experiences the past differently, so I'm not really sure how they've experienced, the same events, and etc. And so it allowed for a deeper connection, one, with people that I've known my whole life, which is really beautiful, but also I think it allowed for a more organic way for the audience into the kind of the world that I grew up in.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and especially inserting yourself into the documentary. I feel like that vulnerability probably gives a feeling of a more honest portrayal, because of that exact thing that you're talking about. Like I love the concept of your documentary as someone who identifies as cis heterosexual male, right? Like, especially, it's very timely, right? Like, especially now in 2023, like this idea of what is masculinity, but there are these assumptions that are made about it. And for instance, as a stupid little anecdote, like I have no problem going out with my wife and like wearing like a full romper. And the other night we went to this event and like I got face paint done and it like matched my outfit. And all night long I was getting compliments and they were all from men. And it was all this idea. And as far as I could tell, most of them were probably straight identifying, and I just realized that there is this assumption with what masculinity is. And when people who identify as typically masculine see people break out of that, it can have very interesting results.
Yeah. I mean, that's so fascinating. I mean, I think that's actually a really hopeful story, in my opinion, because I mean, I feel like there are a lot of circles or a world, 10 or 20 years ago where, either you would have felt very uncomfortable doing that.
Yes.
Like people would have been judging you and like you would not be getting compliments from other men in the room.
Absolutely. I mean, I also, I live in San Diego, which it's a very interesting city. Like it has a sort of interesting mix of conservative ideology with very liberal, like, Californian ideology. So it can be unpredictable, like kind of depending on the area you're in. Personally, I've reached an area in my life where I just don't give a shit. Like I am comfortable enough to not give a shit. And it's very interesting to see all of the men who are not.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the whole, thing of like, I feel like everyone is collectively questioning, a lot of people are questioning what masculinity is, what gender is, and are looking for different ways of being masculine, looking at different ways of understanding gender that's more liberating and more kinder and not as, really violent or harsh or traumatic. And then I think there's also, but I think that can be destabilizing, right? So redefining something, questioning it can be, there's a moment of like, well, then who am I, right? If you're questioning something that's very sensitive, very core of yourself. And so I think that sometimes that's like where fragile masculinity, kind of toxic fragile masculinity comes into, is this like, if you feel like you're being challenged and something core within you is unstable, then I think one response is what we see, like violence or
absolutely.
Yeah,
it can be very scary.
And like some of the people I interview, like they definitely like have this moment of like, if I'm not this way, then what does that make me? And I think, what makes the people I interviewed so kind of amazing is that they became softer through the experience versus becoming harder. Like they allowed the uncertainty to kind of shape them in a way that made them more open to the world. And I was kind of curious as to like how that happens.
Mhm.
You know, like why did some people become more closed, but then there are those who become more open, and kind of examining that too. So sorry, that's a lot of, but yeah, it's a huge
big subject.
It's a really big subject, and it's really important. So
yeah, I mean, if anything, I would imagine as a project, just on a conceptual thematic level, it was more about where to narrow than where to keep it from going into further and further details outside of the scope of something it's manageable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why, like, I think I tried to, it kind of, what I tried to focus on was like just looking at non-traditional. So like less, I'm not making a documentary about it is, inadvertently, it is about the ramifications of toxic masculinity. It is about the effects of patriarchy, but it's not directly about those things. Those things come up because it's about people who are like kind of living outside of the norm. And that was kind of like my lens that I try to keep very narrow. Again, very challenging, but that was like I was like, okay, so it's like, what is alternative, and what is non-traditional, and what can we learn from people who are already living into that? Was kind of like my lens. And so then that helps narrow it down a little bit, you know? I mean, of course, like when you're doing the interviews, you're just like, you can totally like, I didn't mean to do this, but I ended up like interviewing two people who are both gay, and were both in the one was in the military when you were like kicked out, like, and like, you know, just honorable discharge. And then the other one was in the military during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And like their experiences were really interesting, but I can't like, that's not gonna make it into the movie, you know, like it's really fascinating stuff. So that's another part about documentaries too, is like figuring out like what is the streamlining. So
to have a North Star to sort of follow. Yeah. One last question about the content of the documentary. This might sound like a dumb question, but I figure I might be one of the first people to ask it. So, is masc a double meaning?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I think, you know, it's short, well, one, you know, it's like short for masculine.
Sure.
But then of course, like there's this idea of, you know, a lot of people talk about like putting a mask on to try to present as masculine as a certain way, hiding who you really are. And then also I feel like it has like a third meaning, like, you know, like this, like even in queer male communities, there's this like common term used, masc for masc, you know, about like people looking for masculine people, and kind of questioning what that even is, and why we use those terms. So it's kind of this, there's a lot going on in the title, I guess.
Direct people to, like, where are you in the crowdfunding? What's your goals for crowdfunding? Where are you right now? And where should people go to help get the project finished?
Yeah, so we're almost halfway to fully funded, so we still have a bit of a ways to go. So like any little bit helps, and right now is like a really critical time, because we just need more, keep the momentum going. And with the platform it's on, we have to raise at least 80% of our goal to keep what we've raised. So really working towards getting fully funded, but at the very least, definitely getting 80%. You can find more at Seed and Spark's website and search for MASC. Go to my social media channels. So just search, you know, either Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Andy Motz, MOTZ, and I'll have all the links there. And you can even go to my website, andymotz.com, and there's a page there that will send you to the fundraising or the crowdfunding link as well. So any support would be much appreciated.
I think this sounds like a really cool documentary. I think it sounds very interesting, and conceptually something that especially men need to have this conversation right now, in this time, and in a climate that allows for people like Joe Rogan and Andrew Tate to sort of dominate that kind of conversation. I think that we definitely need an understanding of alternate identities of masculinity.
Yeah, and I think that was I think they dominate so much. Toxic masculinity dominates so much of the conversation, and I think it's hard sometimes to see like, well, what could be an alternative? And I think, but the thing is, we see it every day, and so hopefully the film highlights that everydayness of those pushing against the toxic forms.